The sound of Victoria Vance's shrill, booming laughter echoed off the polished marble walls of the 45th floor, cutting through the heavy air of the executive lobby like a rusty blade. Dozens of employees stood frozen in place, their eyes wide, their breath hitched in collective shock. Standing in the center of that glass and gold fortress, I held a stack of battered beige folders tightly against my chest, my hands trembling as cold tears spilled down my cheeks. My oversized gray cardigan was frayed, with a gaping hole near the shoulder, smudged with dust and soot from the basement archive room I had been forced to clean by hand. Pinned to my lapel was a cheap plastic name tag that read one single dismissive word: Intern. Right in front of me stood Victoria Vance, the senior vice president of marketing at Prestige Corporate. She wore a tailored crimson-red blazer that practically screamed opulence, her gold jewelry catching the harsh overhead lights as she bent forward, pointing her manicured red fingernail directly at my face. Her jaw was unhinged in hysterical, theatrical amusement. Beside her, Julian Hayes, the head of operations, stood with his arms crossed, throwing his head back in roaring laughter, reveling in my absolute degradation. "Look at her," Victoria screeched, her voice reverberating across the open-plan office for every executive, assistant, and board member to hear. "Look at this filthy, pathetic little insect. She actually thought she could present a strategy file to my committee. Look at your clothes, girl. Look at your face. You belong in a homeless shelter, not in the halls of Prestige Corporate. You are nothing but trash." The entire floor was dead silent except for their vicious laughter. Colleagues covered their mouths in horror, but not a single person stepped forward to defend me. They knew that defying Victoria Vance meant career suicide. They saw a helpless, broken intern sobbing under the weight of ruthless corporate cruelty. What none of them realized was that beneath the dirt smudges, the torn fabric, and the tears, I was not just another nameless girl from the bottom of the food chain. My name was Clara Sterling. My father was Arthur Sterling, the founder, sole owner, and chairman of Prestige Corporate. And every single person in this room was about to learn what happens when you crush the wrong girl under your heel. 3 weeks earlier, my life looked entirely different. I was 24 years old, sitting in the high-rise office of my father's private estate overlooking Manhattan. I had just graduated at the top of my class from London Business School, holding a master's degree in corporate finance and organizational restructuring. My father sat across from me in a plush leather armchair, a heavy silver pen resting between his fingers, his face weathered by 40 years of building an international empire from the ground up. Prestige Corporate was his legacy, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise spanning commercial real estate, global logistics, and brand management. But over the last 2 years, something rotten had taken root within the company's core. Employee turnover was at an all-time high. Whispers of embezzled funds were circulating quietly among auditors, and the company culture had dissolved into a toxic nightmare dominated by fear and nepotism. "I need to hand over the reins soon, Clara," my father had told me, his voice heavy with fatigue. "My health isn't what it used to be, but I refuse to hand you a sinking ship or a nest of vipers. I hear reports from the executives, but they only tell me what they think I want to hear. I don't know who is loyal, who is corrupt, or how our everyday staff are being treated." I stared at the blueprints of our flagship headquarters on the glass table between us. I knew that if I walked in through the front doors on day one in a designer suit as Clara Sterling, the heiress and incoming chief operating officer, everyone would put on a show. They would bow, smile, kiss my ring, and hide their true nature behind a wall of polished lies. "Then don't introduce me as your daughter," I said quietly, looking my father in the eye. "Put me on the payroll as a zero-level unpaid intern in the marketing department. Strip away my name, my access, and my security clearance. Let me enter from the absolute bottom. Let me see who these people really are when they think no one important is watching." My father hesitated, his fatherly instincts warring with his business wisdom. "Clara, our corporate culture at the manager level has turned cutthroat. You will be treated without mercy." "Good," I replied firmly. "Because when I take my seat at the head of the board table, I need to know exactly whose heads need to roll." With only my father and his personal attorney knowing the truth, I crafted my alias, Clara Hayes, a struggling university dropout with no family connections, no money, and no voice. I rented a cramped 50-square-foot room on the outer edge of Queens, bought second-hand clothes from thrift stores, and signed an intern contract that paid minimum wage. My first day at Prestige Corporate was a brutal awakening to the reality of lower-level corporate life. I arrived at 7 in the morning, wearing a faded linen shirt and an ill-fitting gray cardigan. As I tried to enter through the primary glass turnstiles of the main lobby, a security guard shoved his arm out, blocking my path. "Service entrance is around back, girl," he snapped without even looking at my badge. "Executive lobby is for executives and clients." "I'm an intern assigned to the 45th floor," I said politely, offering my identification. He snorted, barely glancing at it. "Yeah, well, use the freight elevator, and don't stand around blocking the line." I took a deep breath, swallowing the sharp words that wanted to leap from my throat, and walked down the cold concrete alleyway to the rear freight lift. When I finally reached the marketing department on the 45th floor, I was immediately greeted by the towering, imposing figure of Victoria Vance. Victoria was 38, meticulously groomed, and wore an aggressive scarlet-red suit that radiated dominance. She moved through the office like a monarch reviewing her subjects, flanked by her chief enforcer, Julian Hayes. Julian was an arrogant 32-year-old director who spent more time adjusting his Swiss watch than reviewing performance metrics. Victoria didn't even bother asking for my name when I stood before her desk. She casually tossed a 50-page file onto the floor at my feet. "Pick that up," she commanded, not looking up from her tablet. "You are the new bottom feeder. Your job is simple. Coffee at 6:30 sharp, 3 shots of espresso for me, cold foam, exact temperature. You handle the shredding, you organize the basement archives, and you do not speak unless spoken to. If I see you standing still for more than 10 seconds, I will sign your termination papers before lunch. Am I clear?" "Yes, Ms. Vance," I replied softly, bending down to collect the scattered papers from the carpet. Beside her, Julian smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Make sure you clean the basement storage rooms on floor 3 today, intern. It hasn't been dusted in 5 years. Don't come back up until every box is categorized." For the first 2 weeks, I lived in an absolute nightmare of deliberate overwork and psychological degradation. I worked 14 hours a day, scrubbing coffee stains out of carpets, filing thousands of paper records in pitch-black basement storage rooms filled with mold and dust, and taking the fall for mistakes made by senior managers. I saw how Victoria and Julian ran the department. They stole ideas from junior staff, taking credit for brilliant campaigns while threatening to fire anyone who complained. I watched them verbally abuse middle managers, drive young assistants to tears in the restrooms, and create an atmosphere of paranoid terror. More importantly, as I sorted through forgotten paper ledgers in the dark corners of the basement archive, I stumbled upon something far more sinister than simple workplace toxicity. I discovered 2 sets of accounting records for marketing vendor contracts spanning the last 3 years. Millions of dollars earmarked for international digital campaigns were being routed through shell companies registered in Delaware, companies directly controlled by Victoria Vance and Julian Hayes. They weren't just bullies. They were systematically embezzling money from my father's company, stealing millions right under the board's nose, while using fear to keep the accounting staff silent. I spent my nights in my tiny Queens room cataloging digital copies of the fraudulent invoices, building an airtight legal docket on my personal, encrypted laptop. I had all the evidence I needed to send them both to federal prison for a decade. But I waited. I needed to see just how far their arrogance would carry them. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. The executive committee was scheduled to host a massive preliminary meeting with prospective global partners, a deal worth $50 million to Prestige Corporate. Victoria had spent the week stressing over the presentation deck. What she didn't know was that the strategy file her team had prepared was fundamentally flawed, based on outdated market research that would have bankrupted the project within 6 months. Knowing the risk to my family's business, I spent 48 hours straight, after finishing my endless cleaning duties, compiling a comprehensive, flawless risk assessment and market strategy file. I bound it neatly in beige folders, intending to place it on Victoria's desk anonymously so the company wouldn't suffer during the client presentation. At 9 in the morning, I carried the stack of folders up from the basement. I was completely exhausted. My hair was tied up in a messy, loose bun, my face was smudged with dark dust from the archive boxes, and my old gray cardigan had caught on a rusty file cabinet, tearing a gaping hole near my right shoulder. I looked battered, filthy, and utterly broken. As I walked past the executive suites toward Victoria's office, Julian Hayes intentionally stepped out from around a corner, extending his foot. I tripped, tumbling violently onto the marble floor. The folders clattered across the slick tiles, and my knees slammed hard against the ground. "Watch where you're going, you blind rat," Julian barked loudly, loud enough to draw every eyes on the floor. Victoria stepped out of her corner office, her eyes locking onto me as I scrambled on my hands and knees to collect the files. When her eyes caught the header on the top page, a document analyzing her strategy flaws, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She snatched the folder from my hand, skimmed the first paragraph, and realized instantly that an intern had exposed her incompetence. Instead of dealing with it professionally, her instincts as a predator kicked in. She decided to destroy me publicly so completely that no one would ever listen to a word I said. She grabbed me by the arm, dragging me into the very center of the bustling executive lobby, right beneath the grand gold emblem of Prestige Corporate. "Everyone gather round," Victoria screamed at the top of her lungs. "Come see the sheer, delusional audacity of our trash intern." Dozens of employees, department heads, and visiting associates poured out of their offices, forming a wide circle around us. Victoria pointed her long, red-nailed finger inches from my nose, her face twisted in a horrific, laughing sneer. "Look at her," she shrieked, her voice echoing through the entire floor. "Look at this filthy, pathetic little insect. She actually thought she could present a strategy file to my committee. Look at your clothes, girl. Look at your face. You belong in a homeless shelter, not in the halls of Prestige Corporate. You are nothing but trash." Julian Hayes joined her side, crossing his arms and roaring with laughter. "You're a disgrace, Clara. You can't even clean a floor right, and now you think you're an executive. You're fired. Effective right now. Get your pathetic belongings and get the hell out of this building before I have security throw you into the gutter where you belong." Tears streamed down my smudged cheeks as I hugged the remaining beige folders against my chest. The humiliation was absolute. The crowd stared in stunned, uncomfortable silence. Some looked pitying, others turned their eyes away in fear, but Victoria and Julian stood over me, reveling in their display of absolute, unchecked power. Victoria reached out, grabbing my name tag and tearing it violently off my cardigan, dropping it onto the floor and stomping her high heel directly onto it, cracking the plastic. "You are nothing," Victoria hissed into my face, leaning down so close I could smell her expensive perfume. "You are an absolute nobody." I lowered my head, letting my shoulders shake as if I were collapsing under the weight of her cruelty. But behind my hands, as I wiped the tears from my cheeks, the pain vanished. It was replaced by a cold, sharp, razor-thin clarity. The test was over. The truth had been revealed. Slowly, deliberately, I stopped shaking. I stood up to my full height, pulling my shoulders back. The helpless, trembling posture of Clara the intern vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, imposing stature that froze Victoria's laughter mid-throat. I looked Victoria directly in the eyes. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. My voice dropped into an icy, calm baritone that echoed with chilling authority across the silent lobby. "You have a very loud voice for someone whose career ends in 10 minutes, Victoria." The entire lobby gasped. Victoria blinked, stunned by the sudden, terrifying shift in my aura. "What did you just say to me?" she snarled, trying to regain her footing. "Security, get this lunatic out of here." "Security won't be taking me anywhere," I said smoothly, reaching into my frayed cardigan pocket. I pulled out a small, sleek black keycard, and master clearance pass embedded with gold microchips that only 3 people in the entire global conglomerate possessed. I stepped over to the executive elevator panel on the central wall and swiped the card. A loud, high-pitched chime reverberated through the lobby, and the digital display above the doors flashed brightly in bold crimson letters. Override accepted executive owner access level 1 ***. The elevator doors slid open immediately. Stepping out of the private cabin was my father, Arthur Sterling, flanked by 4 senior federal prosecutors, 2 uniformed police officers, and the head of global corporate security. The atmosphere in the room plummeted 50 degrees. Julian Hayes turned a ghastly shade of pale, his arms dropping limply to his sides. Victoria stared at my father, then at the federal agents, her chest heaving in sudden, blind confusion. "Mr. Sterling," Victoria stammered, instantly plastering a fake, panicked smile across her face as she stepped forward. "Sir, we were just dealing with a security breach. This intern, this incompetent girl, was causing a massive disruption in your lobby. I was just having her removed." My father didn't even look at her. He walked right past Victoria, stopping directly in front of me. In front of 60 horrified, speechless employees, Arthur Sterling took off his tailored cashmere coat, gently draping it over my dirty, torn shoulders. He looked at the smudges on my face, his eyes burning with a deep, furious pride. "Are you all right, my daughter?" he asked, his voice echoing clearly across the dead-silent floor. "Daughter?" The word dropped into the room like an atomic bomb. Victoria's jaw dropped so wide it looked unhinged. Julian stumbled backward, his knees buckling until he had to catch himself against a marble pillar. The crowd of employees gasped in unison, several people covering their mouths as the terrifying reality of what had just transpired crystallized in their minds. "I'm perfectly fine, Dad," I said calmly, taking off my smudged cardigan and letting it fall to the floor. Underneath, despite the dirt, I stood tall in the crisp white shirt I had worn every day. "In fact, my research is officially complete." I turned slowly to face Victoria and Julian. The 2 of them were shaking so violently they could barely stand. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a diamond blade. "My name is Clara Sterling. I am the incoming Chief Executive Officer and majority shareholder of Prestige Corporate." Victoria's face drained of every drop of color, turning a sickly, translucent gray. "See Clara, Sterling," she whispered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched squeak. No, that's impossible. You're an intern. You were cleaning the toilets." "I was observing," I corrected her, taking the thick dossier from my father's attorney and holding it up. "I was observing how you treat the people who build this company. I was observing how you steal from the hardworking staff who earn minimum wage while you pocket millions in illegal kickbacks." I opened the folder, pulling out the primary bank statements. "Julian Hayes, Victoria Vance. Over the last 3 years, you have embezzled $6.4 million through offshore accounts in Delaware. You have falsified marketing reports, threatened junior staff with termination if they blew the whistle, and created a culture of fear and degradation." Julian dropped to his knees right there on the marble floor, his hands clasped together in desperate, pathetic pleading. "Clara, Miss Sterling, please, it was Victoria. She forced me to sign those documents. I was just following orders. Please don't ruin my life." "Shut up, Julian," Victoria screamed, her composure completely shattering as she spun on him, her eyes wild with terror. She turned back to me, her hands trembling uncontrollably as tears of blind panic ruined her expensive makeup. "Miss Sterling, Clara, please, you have to understand. It's a cutthroat industry. I was just trying to maintain discipline. I didn't know who you were if I had known." "If you had known I was the owner's daughter, you would have kissed my feet," I interrupted ruthlessly. "And that is precisely why you are a disease in this company. You treat people with respect only when you think they have the power to destroy you. You treat those below you like garbage because you believe they are helpless." I looked at the lead federal prosecutor, standing beside my father, and gave a single, firm nod. "Officers, take them," I commanded. The two police officers stepped forward, grabbing Victoria by her wrists. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply through the quiet lobby. Victoria let out a horrified, hysterical shriek as her hands were pinned behind her crimson blazer. The same crimson blazer she had worn while mocking my existence 5 minutes ago. Julian was hauled up from his knees, sobbing openly as iron cuffs were locked around his wrists. "You can't do this," Victoria screamed, thrashing as she was led toward the freight elevators, the very elevators she had forced me to use. "My father is a board member. I will sue this company. I will destroy you." "Your father was removed from the board 20 minutes ago by unanimous vote," my father said coldly, not even looking at her as the officers marched them both away. As the elevator doors closed on Victoria's hysterical screaming, a profound, heavy silence settled over the 45th floor. Dozens of employees stood rigid, terrified of what was coming next, wondering if my wrath would extend to everyone who had watched in silence. I walked to the center of the lobby, stepping onto the raised platform near the main reception desk. I looked at every single face in the room. "I know many of you are afraid," I spoke, my voice warm yet uncompromising. "I know many of you stayed quiet because you had families to feed, mortgages to pay, and you were terrified of losing your jobs to cruel bosses. That ends today." I took a deep breath, looking around the room. Starting right now, Victoria Vance's entire management structure is dissolved. Every junior employee, every intern, and every assistant who was passed over for promotions while doing the real work will be interviewed for senior leadership roles. Minimum wages for our entry-level staff will be increased by 30% across the board, effective immediately. For 3 seconds, no one moved. Then, a single junior assistant in the back row began to clap. Within moments, the entire floor erupted into thunderous, deafening applause. Tearful smiles broke out across the faces of young men and women who had suffered under Victoria's reign for years. I turned to my father, who was looking at me with tears of pride in his eyes. He reached out, squeezing my hand tightly. "You're ready, Clara," he whispered. "The company is yours." 2 hours later, I stood alone in the massive corner office on the top floor, the office that now belonged to me. The smudges were gone from my face, my messy hair was styled, and I wore a sharp, custom-tailored dark navy suit. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking over the sprawling skyline of Manhattan. On the mahogany desk behind me lay my old, broken plastic name tag that read Intern, placed inside a small glass frame. I kept it there for a reason, not as a trophy of revenge, but as a permanent reminder. A reminder that true leadership is not measured by the power you wield over others, but by how you lift up those who have no voice. Prestige corporate was no longer a kingdom of fear, and as long as I sat in the executive chair, no one in my company would ever be treated like trash again.